The moment I pulled into my driveway after a 2-week vacation, my stomach sank. My rural property, usually a haven of buzzing bees and babbling creek water, looked like a war zone. The fence along the creek easement was sliced in 3 places, its wires curling like broken springs. One of my beehives lay in ruins, frames scattered across the grass, honey pooling in the dirt. Deep tire marks gouged the creek bank, and worst of all, Pixel, my loyal mutt, limped toward me whimpering. A nail board, spikes up, had been left near the fence line, and one had pierced his paw. I rushed Pixel to the vet, who cleaned the wound, prescribed antibiotics, and warned me to watch for infection. As I paid the $200 bill, fury replaced shock. Karen, my neighbor who'd started this mess over the boundary line, had clearly upped the ante. But the real bombshell came when I checked my email. A confused message from a stranger named Mark, claiming he'd rented my house through the HOA for $2,000. The HOA, led by Karen's ally Chandler, had declared my home abandoned while I was away, citing my unkempt yard and absence. They'd forged documents to justify renting it out, funneling the cash to Karen's schemes. Mark had moved in 2 days ago, and my return had thrown him into a panic. I was done playing defense. First, I called Mark, calmly explaining the situation and asking him to vacate by morning. He agreed, apologetic, and left with his bags. Then I ordered 4 motion sensor cameras from Amazon, each set to ping my phone every 10 seconds with alerts until I muted them. By dusk, they were mounted, 2 on the house, 2 by the creek. Next, I hired Nora Beltran, a licensed surveyor with a reputation for precision and a no-nonsense attitude. She arrived the next morning, her pickup kicking up dust, and got to work. By noon, fluorescent orange stakes marked my property's corners, each paired with a laminated placard warning of criminal penalties for tampering with survey monuments. "Let's see Karen mess with this," Nora said, hammering the final stake. That night at 1:13 a.m., my phone lit up with camera alerts. I opened the live stream, heart pounding, and saw 2 figures in hoodies creeping along the creek. One wielded bolt cutters, snipping at my new fence, the other yanked Nora's stakes, tossing them into the water with a splash. Moonlight glinted off the shorter figure's platinum blonde hair, Karen unmistakable. The taller one turned, and the camera caught his face, Chandler, a local troublemaker known for shady deals. I saved the footage and dialed Deputy Rogers. Rogers arrived at dawn, his cruiser parked discreetly down the road. I showed him the video and his eyes narrowed. "That's Chandler Hayes," he said. "Busted him for fraud a few years back." He recognized Karen, too, from her sheriff call during our boundary spat. Armed with my footage, Rogers secured a warrant for criminal mischief and trespassing. By 6 a.m., he and 2 deputies knocked on Chandler's door. Body cam footage later showed Chandler, bleary-eyed in pajama pants, insisting he'd been asleep all night. Rogers held up a still from my camera, Chandler, mid-grimace, clutching bolt cutters. Chandler's jaw dropped and he went silent. Karen's arrest was less smooth. Rogers found her at home, sipping coffee like nothing had happened. A search of her garage turned up Nora's stolen stakes, a half-empty can of spray paint matching the red defacing my no trespassing signs, and a stack of laminated placards, crumpled but intact. Karen claimed Chandler had stored tools there without her knowledge, but Rogers wasn't buying it. "You're on camera, Ms. Davis," he said, cuffing her. Both were booked into county jail by noon. Karen posted bond within hours, her lawyer already spinning excuses. Chandler wasn't so lucky. His 2021 check-kiting conviction had him on probation, and this stunt triggered a no-bond hold pending a revocation hearing. As I cleaned Pixel's paw that evening, I felt a flicker of triumph. The cameras had worked. Nora's stakes had baited the trap, but the email from Mark lingered in my mind. Karen and Chandler hadn't just vandalized my land, they'd tried to steal my home. I called my lawyer, Elliot, and asked him to dig into the HOA's records. If Karen thought this was over, she was about to learn how wrong she was. With Karen and Chandler in custody, I thought the worst was over. My cameras had caught them red-handed, and Deputy Rogers had hauled them to county jail for vandalizing my property. But the email from Mark, the tenant who'd rented my house for $2,000 while I was on vacation, gnawed at me. Karen had convinced the HOA to declare my home abandoned, forging documents to justify renting it out. The cash had vanished, and I suspected Chandler, the HOA's bookkeeper, knew where it went. I called my lawyer, Elliot, a sharp-witted bulldog who thrived on unraveling scams. Subpoena the HOA's financials, I said. This goes deeper than a cut fence. Elliot moved fast, filing a court order to access the HOA's records. Within days, we had a stack of bank statements, ledgers, and canceled checks. The findings were jaw-dropping. Chandler had written a $3,500 cashier's check from the HOA's reserve account to buy the illegal gate Karen planted on my creek easement. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Over 2 years, Chandler had siphoned $46,900 for grounds improvements that never happened, phantom landscaping, non-existent repairs, and most gallingly, the $2,000 for my house's rental, labeled as miscellaneous income. The tenant's payment had been deposited straight into an account linked to Karen, disguised as consulting fees. I sat at my kitchen table, Pixel snoring at my feet as Elliot laid out the evidence. "This isn't just vandalism," he said, tapping the ledger. "It's felony theft and conspiracy." The HOA board, a group of well-meaning but clueless retirees, was blindsided. At an emergency meeting, they voted unanimously to press charges against Chandler and demanded an explanation from Karen, who'd served as their compliance officer. Their trust in her had been a blank check for fraud. Detective Miriam Page, from the county's white-collar crime unit, took over the investigation. A wiry woman with a knack for digital forensics, she seized Chandler's home computer and external drives. What she found was a goldmine: forged receipts for fake landscaping jobs, doctored HOA meeting minutes, and a Word template for neon green approval stamps used on fraudulent invoices. One email thread between Chandler and Karen was particularly damning. "Once we annex the creek lot," Karen wrote, "the HOA can sell it for $50K, your cut's 20%. Chandler's reply: "Need another abandoned claim to push it through. Your neighbor's house was a good start." My blood boiled. They'd planned to steal my land by exploiting HOA rules, using my vacation as cover. Karen lawyered up immediately. Her attorney, James Hall, charged $600 an hour and stonewalled Page's questions with smug deflections. Karen claimed she'd only advised Chandler on HOA policy and had no idea about the forged documents or rental scheme. But the evidence was piling up, and her garage, stuffed with my stolen survey stakes and red spray paint, tied her directly to the vandalism. She wasn't slipping away this time. Chandler, meanwhile, was sweating. His 2021 check-kiting conviction had him on thin ice, and the new charges, felony theft, conspiracy, and probation violation, could land him in prison for years. Stuck in jail on a no-bond hold, he cracked under pressure. Detective Page offered a deal: testify truthfully against Karen, and the DA would recommend a reduced sentence. Chandler, pale and twitchy in his orange jumpsuit, signed the agreement. "Karen ran the show," he told Page, detailing how she'd orchestrated the land grab, the fake abandoned claim, and the rental scam to fund it. He handled the paperwork and dirty work, believing her promises of a big payout. As the investigation wrapped up, the HOA board sent me a letter of apology, admitting they'd been duped by Karen's lies about my abandoned property. They promised reforms, quarterly audits, open meetings, and offered to cover Pixel's $200 vet bill as a gesture. I accepted, but my eyes were on the bigger fight. Elliot was prepping for court, and Chandler's testimony would be our ace. Karen's smug confidence was about to crash. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly, dreaming of my bees buzzing in a greenhouse I'd build on the land she'd tried to steal. The tide had turned, and I was ready to see her pay. The county courthouse smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, its benches packed with neighbors whispering about the trial of the decade. Karen Davis and Chandler Hayes faced a jury for their brazen scheme: vandalism, theft, felony conspiracy, and the HOA's audacious attempt to declare my house abandoned and rent it out while I was on vacation. My lawyer Elliot had spent weeks preparing, armed with Detective Page's forensic haul, forged HOA documents, incriminating emails, and my Ring camera footage. But the real game changer was Chandler, who'd flipped to testify against Karen for a lighter sentence. As I sat in the gallery, Pixel's warm memory at home steadied my nerves. This was it. The prosecutor, a no-nonsense woman named Lena Ortiz, opened with a bombshell. She played my camera footage on a courtroom screen: Karen and Chandler, cloaked in hoodies, loading rebar into her SUV at 12:47 a.m., the creek glinting behind them. The timestamp matched the night my survey stakes vanished. Gasps rippled through the room. Ortiz then displayed an email from Karen to Chandler. Label the house abandoned by next week. The tenant's cash will cover the gate. My jaw clenched. They exploited my 2-week vacation to rent my home for $2,000, pocketing the money to fund their land grab. Chandler took the stand, his orange jumpsuit swapped for a cheap suit, sweat beading on his brow. Under Ortiz's questioning, he spilled everything. Karen had masterminded the plan to annex my creekside lot, promising him a 20% cut of the $50,000 the HOA could fetch by selling it. She fabricated the abandoned claim, citing my unkempt yard, a lie since I'd mowed before leaving, and forged HOA minutes to justify renting my house to an unsuspecting tenant. Chandler admitted to funneling the rental cash and $46,900 in HOA funds into Karen's account, disguised as consulting fees and fake landscaping invoices. She said it was foolproof, he mumbled, avoiding Karen's glare. Karen's attorney, James Hall, tried to spin her as a victim of Chandler's deceit. Karen, poised in a navy blazer, claimed she'd only advised on HOA policy and had no knowledge of the vandalism or fraud. But Ortiz dismantled her defense. She presented my stolen survey stakes found in Karen's garage and a can of red spray paint matching my defaced "no trespassing" signs. A bank statement showed the $2,000 tenant payment deposited into Karen's account the day Mark moved in. Hall's objections faltered as the jury leaned forward, riveted. My testimony was brief but heavy. I described returning from vacation to find my fence cut, my beehive smashed, and Pixel limping from a nail board. I recounted Mark's email revealing the HOA's rental scam and the violation of knowing strangers had slept in my home. Karen didn't just want my land, I said, voice steady. She wanted to erase my place here. The jury's eyes followed me as I stepped down, and I felt their sympathy. After 3 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for just 4 hours. The foreman read the verdict: guilty on all counts, felony conspiracy, theft, criminal mischief, and misdemeanor trespass. Karen's face crumpled as her bond was revoked. Chandler, already facing a probation violation for his 2021 check kiting, hung his head. The judge sentenced Karen to 18 months in prison, $32,000 restitution to me for damages, and $46,900 to the HOA for the embezzled funds. A 5-year no-contact order would follow her release. Chandler got 4 years with parole eligibility after 2 thanks to his testimony. As bailiffs led them away, I met Karen's eyes and offered a polite wave, not malice but closure. She looked away. Outside the courthouse, the air felt lighter. The HOA board, chastened by their role in the abandoned fiasco, formally rescinded the claim and refunded Mark's $2,000, which he'd paid in good faith. Elliot handed me a court order ensuring no future HOA overreach. I drove home, the creek sparkling under the afternoon sun, and hugged Pixel, whose paw had healed. My bees buzzed in their rebuilt hive, a hum of resilience. That evening, I sketched plans for a greenhouse where Karen's illegal gate once stood. It would be a place of growth, not greed, with tomato starts and sunflowers stretching toward the sky. The trial had stripped away the chaos, leaving space for new beginnings. I poured a glass of iced tea, sat on my porch, and watched the sunset paint the creek gold. The land was mine again, not just on paper, but in spirit. Karen and Chandler's schemes had crumbled, and I'd built something stronger in their wake. For the first time in months, I felt whole. A year after the trial, my property felt like a sanctuary again. The greenhouse gleamed where Karen's illegal gate once stood, its shelves bursting with tomatoes and basil. Pixel chased fireflies along the creek, his paw long healed from that wretched nailboard. The HOA's abandoned claim, a lie that let Karen and Chandler rent out my house during my vacation, was a distant memory, buried under court orders and convictions. Karen was serving her 18-month sentence, and Chandler faced 4 years, their schemes undone by my cameras and Elliot's legal tenacity. I thought the fight was over. Then a letter arrived, threatening to reopen old wounds. The envelope bore the name Elaine Castor, claiming to be Karen's cousin and heir. She insisted Karen had granted her a private right-of-way across my creekside lot, attaching a deed that looked suspiciously fresh. My heart sank, but I'd learned not to flinch. I called Elliot, who spotted the forgery within minutes. The deed's notary seal was dated after Karen's arrest, and the signature didn't match court records. We filed a motion to dismiss, and Elaine, sensing defeat, withdrew her claim before the hearing. She was fishing for a payout, Elliot said, tossing the deed into his shredder. I exhaled, the creek's gentle ripple outside my window a reminder of what I'd fought to keep. Restitution began to trickle in, small but symbolic. The state's crime victim fund sent a $1,200 check, drawn from seized assets, to cover fence repairs. Karen's prison wages, garnished at $58 a month, arrived in meager increments, a drop in the bucket against the $32,000 she owed me and $46,900 to the HOA. It would take decades to clear, but each check felt like a quiet victory. I deposited them without fanfare, using the funds to buy heirloom seeds for the greenhouse. The land deserved to bloom, not bear grudges. Then came a surprise from Chandler. A letter postmarked from the state penitentiary landed in my mailbox. His handwriting was neat, almost contrite. He'd earned a paralegal certificate in prison, he wrote, and was studying property law. I'm sorry for the harm I caused, he said, no trace of the weasel who'd wielded bolt cutters under Karen's orders. Enclosed was a hand-drawn map, suggesting spots for an orchard on my lot, apple trees by the creek, pears near the greenhouse. It was an odd gesture, but sincere. I wrote back, keeping it brief. The sunflowers are taller than ever. Keep learning. No promises, but no hate either. The fight had taken enough. The real closure came from an unexpected source. Sprout Tomorrow, an organic farming nonprofit, bought Karen's property at auction, her once manicured lawn now a blank canvas. They reached out, inviting me to consult on planting native pollinators to complement my bees. The irony was rich. Karen's land, a battleground for her greed, would become a haven for butterflies and blooms. I met their director, Leela, a botanist with soil-stained hands and a warm laugh. We walked the lot, sketching plans for milkweed, coneflowers, and bee balm. This is bigger than us, Leela said, gesturing to the creek. I nodded, feeling the weight of the past lift. The first volunteer day was a revelation. Neighbors, once divided by Karen's HOA reign, showed up with shovels and seedlings. Mrs. Larson, the new HOA board chair, planted lavender with a smile. Tom, the mechanic, hauled compost, joking about Karen's downfall. Even Deputy Rogers swung by, trading his badge for a trowel to dig beds for wild indigo. I loaned them my brush cutter, its blade slicing through weeds where Karen's fence posts once stood. By dusk, the lot was transformed, rows of tiny plants, stakes marking future growth, and laughter filling the air. Pixel romped nearby, sniffing the fresh earth. As I stood on my porch that night, the creek's song blending with the hum of my bees, I saw Karen's land differently. It wasn't hers anymore, it was ours, a community's promise to grow something better. The greenhouse glowed softly, its sunflowers nodding in the breeze. Pixel curled up at my feet and I scratched his ears. The fight had come full circle, from destruction to creation. Karen's shadow was gone, replaced by roots and hope. This land, my home, was alive again. The seasons had turned since Karen's conviction, and my property was no longer a battleground. The greenhouse stood proud where her illegal fence once blocked my creek, its glass walls cradling tomatoes and sunflowers. Pixel, my faithful dog, romped through the grass, his paw healed from the nailboard Karen's scheme had left behind. The HOA's abandoned claim, a lie that let Karen and Chandler rent out my house for $2,000 during my vacation, was a fading scar erased by court victories and a reformed HOA. Karen was serving her 18-month sentence, and Chandler faced 4 years, their land grab undone by my cameras and Elliot's legal prowess. But the true triumph came not from their defeat, but from what grew in its place. Sprout Tomorrow, the organic farming nonprofit that bought Karen's property at auction, had a vision: turn her manicured lawn into a community garden, a haven for pollinators and people. They'd invited me to consult on native plants, and I'd help plan beds of milkweed and coneflowers to complement my bees. Now, as spring unfurled, the project was ready to bloom. Leela, Sprout Tomorrow's director, called me one crisp morning. "Volunteer days tomorrow," she said, her voice bright. "Bring your brush cutter, we're making history." I grinned, imagining Karen's face if she knew her land was becoming a shared sanctuary. The volunteer day dawned golden, the creek sparkling under a cloudless sky. I arrived at Karen's former lot with my brush cutter, its blade glinting like a promise. The scene was alive with neighbors, dozens of them armed with shovels, seedlings, and laughter. Mrs. Larson, the new HOA board chair, knelt in the dirt, planting lavender with care. Tom, the mechanic, hauled wheelbarrows of compost, joking about the time Karen fined him for a non-compliant mailbox. Even Deputy Rogers showed up, his sheriff's badge swapped for a flannel shirt, digging trenches for wild indigo. "Never thought I'd be gardening on her turf," he said, winking. I handed him a trowel and we got to work. The transformation was electric. Where Karen's fence posts once stood, we planted rows of bee balm, their red blooms a magnet for hummingbirds. Raised beds took shape, filled with soil and promise, zucchini, kale, and heirloom tomatoes. I ran the brush cutter through thickets of weeds, clearing space for a pollinator patch Leela designed. Kids from the neighborhood scampered around, scattering milkweed seeds, their giggles blending with the creek's song. Pixel darted between them, tail wagging like a metronome, sniffing fresh earth. By noon, sweat-soaked and smiling, we'd turned Karen's sterile lawn into a patchwork of life. Leela gathered us for a break, passing out lemonade and homemade cookies. "This land was about control," she said, gesturing to the beds. "Now it's about community." Heads nodded and Mrs. Larson raised her glass. "To new beginnings and to you," she said, looking at me. "You fought for your land and gave us a chance to do better." I shrugged, warmth spreading through me. The HOA's apology and $4,500 check had repaired my beehives, but this, neighbors working side by side, was the real restitution. As the day wore on, we staked trellises for peas and strung fairy lights for future gatherings. Tom shared a story about Karen's reign, how she'd bullied a widow over a late HOA fee. "She'd hate this," he laughed, planting a marigold. Rogers chimed in, recalling the night he arrested her, her garage stuffed with my stolen survey stakes. The stories weren't bitter, they were cathartic, a way to bury her legacy in the soil. I added my own, the moment I waved to her in court, closing a chapter. The group cheered and Leela hugged me. "You turned her game into a garden," she said. By dusk, the lot was unrecognizable. Beds brimmed with seedlings, paths wound through wildflowers, and a wooden sign read, "Sprout Tomorrow Community Garden." The fairy lights twinkled as the sun dipped, casting a glow over the creek. Pixel flopped beside me, panting happily, and I scratched his ears. The bees in my nearby hive hummed, as if approving the new neighbors. This wasn't just Karen's defeat, it was a victory for everyone who'd felt her shadow. Her land, once a tool for greed, now fed and united us. That night I stood in my greenhouse, its air thick with the scent of basil. The creek sang beyond the glass and the garden's lights flickered across the way. I thought of Chandler's letter from prison, his orchard sketch a small redemption. I thought of Elaine's failed forgery, a last gasp of Karen's schemes. Most of all, I thought of the volunteers, strangers turned friends, planting roots where division once grew. The fight had come full circle, from a cut fence to a shared harvest. Karen's legacy was gone, replaced by something alive and lasting. As I locked the greenhouse, Pixel at my side, I felt the land breathe with me. The garden wasn't just a win, it was a promise. Tomorrow we'd plant more, and the day after that we'd grow. October's golden light bathed my property, the creek shimmering like a ribbon of glass. The greenhouse, built where Karen's illegal fence once stood, overflowed with ripe tomatoes and sunflowers, their heads bowing under the weight of seeds. Pixel, my steadfast dog, darted through the fields, his paw long-heeled from the nailboard trap of Karen's scheme. The HOA's abandoned claim, vicious lie that let Karen and Chandler rent out my house for $2,000 during my vacation, was a distant echo, silenced by court victories and a reformed HOA. Karen was serving her 18-month sentence, her $32,000 restitution to me trickling in at $58 a month. Chandler faced 4 years, his apology letter tucked in a drawer. The fight was over, but the story was. The land and the community had one final gift to give. Sprout Tomorrow's community garden, sown on Karen's former property, had flourished over the summer. Where her lawn once symbolized control, raised beds now brimmed with kale, zucchini, and heirloom tomatoes. Milkweed and bee balm danced in the breeze, drawing butterflies and my bees in a joyful blur. The nonprofit planned a harvest dinner to celebrate, inviting the neighborhood to taste the fruits of our labor. Leela, the director, called me a week before. "You're the guest of honor," she said, laughing. "Bring Pixel, he's earned it." I smiled, picturing Karen's scowl if she knew her land now fed the community she'd tried to fracture. The dinner was set for a Saturday, tables arranged under strung fairy lights in the garden. I arrived with a basket of greenhouse basil and sunflowers, Pixel trotting at my heels. The air buzzed with chatter and the scent of roasted butternut squash, garlic honey carrots, and heirloom tomato bruschetta, all grown steps away. Mrs. Larson, the HOA's new chair, greeted me with a hug, her apron dusted with flour from baking cornbread. Tom the mechanic manned the grill, flipping burgers with a grin. Deputy Rogers, off-duty in a flannel, passed outsider, joking about the night he'd cuffed Karen in her own garage. Kids wove through the crowd, clutching marigolds they'd picked from the beds. Leela clinked a glass for a toast, the lights twinkling above her. This garden grew from conflict, she said, her voice steady. Karen wanted division, but she nodded at me, showed us how to fight for what's right and build something better. The crowd clapped and Tom called out, "To the bee guy." I laughed, raising my cider, but the words sank deep. The garden wasn't just plants, it was proof that greed could be uprooted, that community could heal what hate had broken. We ate under the stars, plates piled high with garden bounty. A neighbor shared how Karen's HOA fines had once driven her to tears. Now she tended the kale bed with pride. Another recounted Chandler's forged receipts uncovered in the trial. The stories wove a tapestry of resilience, each bite of bruschetta a small victory. I fed Pixel a carrot, his tail thumping, and felt the weight of the past dissolve. The $4,500 the HOA repaid for my beehives, the court's no-contact order, even Elaine's failed forgery, they were milestones, but this dinner was the true closure. After the meal, I wandered the garden, its paths lit by lanterns. The creek's song blended with the hum of my bees, a duet of peace. I thought of the trial, Karen's defeated glare, my polite wave, the jury's swift verdict. I thought of the greenhouse, its seeds sprouting where her gate had stood. Most of all, I thought of this land, once a battlefield, now nourishing us all. The fight had been brutal, but it had led here to laughter and light. The next week, I started a new project. A barn built from the reclaimed wood of Karen's old fence, legitimately permitted by the reformed HOA. Javier, the carpenter who'd fixed my beehives, helped raise the frame, its beams weathered but strong. We worked through crisp mornings, Pixel napping in the sawdust, the creek glinting nearby. When it was done, the barn stood sturdy, its red paint glowing against the fields. Inside, I stored tools, seeds, and a single photo. Me, Pixel, and the garden crew, grinning on volunteer day. It was a reminder of what we'd built and what we'd overcome.